Who invented the first two-handed sword, also known as Zweihander in history? Well, it wasn't even close. The answer is clearly the Chinese. This sword here, the LK Chen Striking Eagle, is an accurate reproduction of a 2,200-year-old sword excavated from the Mausoleum of King Zhao of the Kingdom of Nanyue. It has an impressive 41-inch blade and 5 feet overall length. In a time of antiquity when everybody else in the world used short swords, we'll put this big sword through its paces on different cutting media, including the ballistic gel psi analog, and compare the performance to that of European two-handed swords, such as the Albion Maximilian. The conclusion is actually quite surprising. Again, wooden dowel in the center of the water bottle. See, in half, there's some breakage. As you can see here, 18-inch in circumference, so definitely 20% less material and thickness, but the weight is still the same, 9 pounds of ballistic gel. Keep in mind that the Albion Maximilian, the 15th century two-handed sword tested in the last review, cleaved about 80% of the mass of a ballistic gel psi analog with a bigger cross-section, so it didn't really went through all the way. And this one did, even though it's thinner. This sword has at least 80% of the power of the Albion Maximilian, which carries almost twice the mass as this one, although they have almost identical reach of blade length. It's a testament of the efficiency of this Chinese two-handed sword, indeed. And you can see that it landed on the percussion note on the blade over here, so about the right place to make a cut. And it did cut pretty smoothly until the very end, but it didn't meet the bone. So You can see second cut landed pretty much just square on and cut the bone in half, and the incision is pretty smooth. A little bit, tiny small amount of scooping, but this is about an average circumference for a thigh on an adult male. Thinner than before, less material, but still pretty good simulation of muscle, skin, and the bone. And they cut pretty well. This performance is very comparable to the European two-handed sword. Wow! Look at the flex. You can see the advantage of ballistic Zhao here. There's a sort of a ballistic trajectory of the thrust. You can see the tip went in there, went in about, let's say, 4 inches, which is why it got lodged solidly in this ballistic Zhao and lifted off the stand. So pretty respectable thrusting capability. Again, very respectable cutting capacity. This is a horizontal cut, shave off fleshy parts, but also it cut into the bone as this long incision, just slice the bone in half. And you can see the length of this incision from over here all the way down there. So cut through a lot of dense gel. This is a pretty good illustration of the cutting capacity of this Chinese two-handed sword. You see that it didn't really cut through the bone, but the cut over the muscle is really smooth. There's some tear, but basically it's a whole chunk. And you can see there's not a lot of mass being shaved off, but it went really smoothly. But up here where it met the wooden dowel, it got stopped. But the blade went through the rest of the gel pretty smoothly and tore it out the main chunk. Over here, you can see the bone is still sticking out here, which wasn't really cut. You can see here, similar results. Shave off another slice, and it got stopped by the wooden dowel, but this time it carried the dowel out of the big chunk of mass and it flew off. And look at the chop, very smooth, vertical chop. It went really smoothly. Look at this, parted without any resistance, and the skin and the bottle, it just cut in half. So I would say that this Chinese two-handed sword has about 80-90% of the damaging potential as a Renaissance European Zweihander, but it weighs only half as much. So I would say that's a win. Extremely high efficiency, not to mention these were made more than 2,000 years ago.
Now, the pop culture, especially video games, are largely responsible for the popularity of late medieval and Renaissance European two-handed swords. Zweihander in German, Spadone in Italian, Espadon in French, and Montante in Spanish. Essentially, they are just swords with elongated blades, but also very large hilt to accommodate two-handed usage. Who actually made the first two-handed sword that meets all these criteria? We have to go back more than 2,000 years to the Warring States period of China. Now, I've heard people referring this as Chu dynasty sword. Every time I just have to laugh. It's not Chu dynasty. Chu is an independent kingdom that seceded from the imperial Zhou court. So it's actually the Zhou dynasty, which is the last royal dynasty that proclaimed sovereignty through kingship before China was unified by Qin into the imperial system. It was actually the longest reigning dynasty in Chinese history, lasting over 800 years. Eventually, their central authority waned. Many of their previous dukedoms that was funded by their vassal lords that swore fealty to the king sought increasing independence, and that resulted in a period of instability. Now, there were many dukedom in the spring and autumn period, and I will argue this is a golden age of Chinese history. Now, most Chinese people will recognize the Han dynasty or the Tang dynasty that came later as the height of power of China. I will argue that what laid the foundation of this height came actually in the spring and autumn, and later the Warring States period. Why? Because of the fracturing, the power actually decentralized, and many dukedom sought secession and declared themselves kingdoms during the Warring States period. And during this period, there is a blossom of hundreds of schools of thoughts in philosophy, politics, military strategies and tactics, arts, and the advancement of arms and armor. Now, you can think of it as an equivalence to the ancient Greece in the Hellenic period, where different Greek city-states had independence. They rivaled against each other, and there were constant wars fought between different states and alliance forged. But when there are foreign powers that threaten them, they banded together as a unified entity of Greece. You can say the same about China during this period. And really, it's this interplay between rivalry and cooperation that gave rise to the Chinese identity. Now, going back to the sword, this is commonly referred to as a Chu style sword, as being first popularized in the kingdom of Chu during the Warring States period. They differ from the stereotypical later period Chinese jian in multiple ways. Now, people are familiar with the Chinese jian, which actually just mean any double-edged sword in Chinese language. So it doesn't carry any connotation of origin or period or style. But most people are familiar with this style of later period jian. And you can see here, it's a very standard length, usually between 28 and 30-inch blade, and accommodating primarily a single-handed usage, pretty light and nimble. But this style of jian was a descendant of the early period war swords. Now, these shorter sidearms are generally speaking only status symbols and sidearms for gentlemen and nobility. Now, we recognize a popular Chinese jian form that comes with a relatively narrow blade comparing to European swords, and it doesn't carry a lot of profile taper, and the transition to tip is relatively short, quite nimble and handy, just a very comfortable everyday carry sword, so to speak, and usually has very elaborate hilt components. But if we go back to hundreds of years and even thousands of years ago, this 2,000-year-old sword is the true form of war sword. You can see some similarity in the silhouette of the blade, but the cross-section is actually different. Since the Han dynasty, most jian become four-sided or having a diamond cross-section with a very prominent central ridge in the middle. Early period swords were descendants of Bronze Age swords, and we know that bronze are, generally speaking, soft, and they have less resistance to bending than steel, and definitely spring steel. So you have to make the blade of the sword rather robust. Therefore, most Chinese swords made in the Bronze Age and the periods immediately after usually carry an 8-sided octagonal cross-section. So the idea is to have more than one ridges in the center. And you can see that when there are 4 surfaces on each side of the blade, there are actually 3 ridges to ensure the rigidity of the blade. And even though by late Bronze period, during the Zhou dynasty, steel swords started to replace bronze swords, this 8-sided blade tradition still carries through. So having a more rigid blade is definitely a good idea for these very long-bladed two-handed swords, especially when you look at the width of the blade, it's not that wide. So there's not enough steel to ensure the rigidity if you only have one central ridge. If you can just compare these swords side by side, you can see the size differences. Now, this sword is 5 feet long, 150 centimeters overall. The blade is 41 inches long, and this is based on the largest sword of this style excavated in China from the tomb of King Zhao Mo of Nanyue. Nanyue is a kingdom that was founded at the end of the Warring States period by an exiled general from one of the kingdoms conquered by Qin, which was on a spree of annexing neighboring states that eventually led to the unification of China. The ruler of Qin founded the first empire of China, but his quick success of expansionism deeply corrupted the system, and the dynasty only lasted 15 years. As soon as his son inherited the throne, rebellions spread across the country, and he was soon overthrown and replaced by the Han dynasty, whose rule lasted over 4 centuries and ushered in the golden age of Chinese empire building in the conventional sense. Nanyue became a vassal state to the Han Empire and occupied the deep south of China and northern Vietnam for the Han dynasty. Its territory was adjacent to the former Chu kingdom and inherited many traditions, including swordsmithing from Chu, among which is the making of these extremely long two-handed swords with an octagonal cross-section. Among the famed swordsmiths operating out of the territory of Chu, one legendary figure was considered the grandfather of steel swordmaking in China, Ouyezi, or Master Ouye. He was born in the state of Yue, east of Chu, in the spring and autumn period that came before the Warring States period. Master Ouye made a name for himself by making bronze swords, and several pieces of his work were highly coveted by monarchs of the time. The ownership over these swords even sparked wars between kingdoms. Many of his bronze swords were characterized in the period historical records as performing extremely well in meat cutting tests by cleaving cattle carcasses in half, and extremely durable in abusive tests by hitting large metal objects. He later conducted numerous experiments on steel swordmaking and set up shop near modern-day Longquan, where the water quality and terrain were suitable for repeated experimentation over quenching on multiple blades. The results were fascinating, that he was able to produce these long-bladed two-handed swords out of steel, pretty much the first in the ancient world, 17 centuries before it was a thing in Europe. It's difficult to assign the maker, as there was a tradition of extremely high-status persons wearing these long swords. Even the first emperor of Qin was recorded to have trouble unsheathing the excessively long blade of his personal sword to defend against an assassin that came upon him with a dagger hidden in a scroll. Furthermore, there was a sword-making culture alive and well, succeeding Master Ouye. Not only did he have numerous students that went on to become legends themselves, some of the enthusiastic sword collectors, such as the king of Yue, Gou Jian, experimented on sword making themselves with a degree of success. One of the most valuable swords excavated from China is a bronze sword with the inscription attributing itself as being forged personally by King Gou Jian, who was recorded as an avid sword aficionado that had several pieces of Master Ouye's work in possession, and debated the quality of these pieces with a famous sword critic of his time. I guess eventually owning swords wasn't good enough for him, and he had to take up the hammer himself to forge a few swords. It will be somewhat of a stretch to attribute any one of these grave finds directly to Master Ouye, but I think it's fair to say that they all owe tribute to the pioneer whose endeavors enabled the refinement of the technology involved in the making of these steel swords. Now, King Zhao Mo was recorded in history as a very enthusiastic sword collector, so it's not a surprise that he eventually has several swords of this size and style buried with him. If we look at the trait of this sword, the blade carries a more robust 8-sided octagonal cross-section. Therefore, it can have a more pronounced profile taper, meaning that from the base of the blade, there's more narrowing in the blade. But also, there's a very significant amount of distal tapering. If we compare both of these swords offered by LK Chen, this one is the Roaring Dragon, also a Warring State period sword. Very long, 39.5-inch blade, a meter long just in blade. but this one is 2 inches longer in the blade and 2 inches longer in the hilt. You can see the size difference here. Now, holding these two side by side makes me realize that they are completely different swords. Previously, I saw that there was only a small difference in weight and balance, but also primarily in the hilt design. But now I can see that they handle totally differently. This Roaring Dragon here, also extremely long, 140 centimeters overall, feels just like a very light and nimble longsword, and you can indeed use it as one. Lots of the late medieval European longsword techniques will be applicable, and it's very easy to pull off with this 2 pounds and 5 ounces sword over here. But Striking Eagle here, while only 6 ounces heavier, this one here weighs 2.7 pounds. It's also a very lightweight sword, considering its size, next to the Albion Maximilian late medieval two-handed sword. You can see their blade length is virtually identical, both 41.5 inches, and this Striking Eagle is actually a few inches longer in the hilt. That comes from the extra length in the 10, because the Striking Eagle doesn't carry a heavy pommel like on European swords. It only has a metal cap at the end, so this doesn't serve well as a counterweight. You need more 10 to add more weight to the hilt to balance out the long blade. However, while the Roaring Dragon handles like a typical longsword, this Striking Eagle is undoubtedly a two-handed sword. It pretty much has enough authority and rigidity to behave like a late medieval and early Renaissance two-handed sword, although it carries only half the weight of those swords. And you can see here, I've been holding this two-handed sword in one hand for this long without fatiguing myself. And you have to question, why is that? There's so much similarity between these swords. Why do they handle so differently? Now, we have to examine the dimension and the characteristics of the blade. It's shocking that both of these swords carry very similar blade configuration in terms of width and thickness. You see, I measured the thickness of both swords, and I can't believe that they're almost identical. At the base, both swords are 7.3 millimeters thick. It tapers dramatically down to 4.9 millimeters at the midpoint of the blade. Further down the blade, it tapers a little bit more down to 2.6 millimeters on both blades. So I don't know what procedure LK Chen used for manufacturing, but it is extremely precise. Now there's a little bit of difference in the blade profile. You can see here, they start off pretty much with the same width at the base, just under 31 millimeters wide. But then the longer bladed Striking Eagle here tapers slightly more in the width as I travel along the entire length. However, when you pick up these swords, this one carries definitely more mass, but also a lot more authority. And you have to question why, especially this sword tapers more in the profile. And you have to examine the third criteria of the blade, which is the cross-section. And indeed, the Roaring Dragon has a similar 8-sided cross-section, octagonal in geometry, as the Striking Eagle here. But there's a striking difference in the detail, as the central two facets on the Roaring Dragon are hollow-ground, whereas on the Striking Eagle, they are practically flat. So this subtle hollow-ground geometry pretty much acts as a filler that reduces some weight across the entire blade. Therefore, the Roaring Dragon came out rather light, and you can see it's definitely more flexible. Well, part of it comes from the meter-long blade. As the longer blade obviously has more leverage for you to flex the blade, but it's still adequately rigid. It doesn't really sag over its own weight, but it feels less stable and rigid than the Striking Eagle. And you can see here, even though this sword is longer, it has more rigidity, and that comes from this different setup of octagonal cross-section, whereas it retains more material on the surface of the blade. So surprisingly, this just handles like a Zweihander. Even though it's extremely lightweight, a lot more authority in the cut. You have to commit more, even though it's only 6 ounces heavier than the Roaring Dragon, and the point of balance is also very similar. On the Roaring Dragon is 11 centimeters from the hilt, while on the Striking Eagle is 12 centimeters from the hilt. So I have to say that the Roaring Dragon is one of my favorite Chinese style sword, as it fits my longsword fencing style, and it's just so much more lively. And if you compare the hilt style on these two swords, they are very different, but they are both popular during the Warring States period. And this one here has a short crossguard protruding to the side, much more so than the crossguard on the Striking Eagle, but it's relatively thin. And if you look at the pommel cap, this one here is just a disc with some filework as decoration on the bronze cap. Whereas here, it's a brass fitting, just a very plain pommel cap. So I would say that this one fits more for a bodyguard for the monarch or nobleman, whereas the Roaring Dragon is much more like a fencing sword for high status individuals. Obviously, if you want to do lots of drills, pick the Roaring Dragon. Obviously, if you have enough money, buy both. But if you can only have one, you have to ask yourself, do you do more form training or test cutting? If it's a former, then Roaring Dragon should be your choice, as it's extremely light and lively, shockingly so as a longsword. And it has a very long blade for you to train these routines, to teach yourself not to hit the floor, the ground, or the ceiling, and other surrounding environmental elements. Whereas if you want a two-handed sword for these horizontal sweeping strikes, but also have two edges to train lots of reverse edge cuts, the Striking Eagle is definitely your guy. And nearly 2,000 years later, there was a renewed interest in making these long-bladed Chinese swords. But be aware that those are all single-edged swords, and their usage are mostly inspired by Japanese swordsmanship at the time, and they bear almost no relationship to these double-edged two-handed swords made in the antiquity. In test cutting, I would predict that the Striking Eagle will perform a little bit better. I'm aware that there are some manufacturing variations on different batches for LK Chen swords. So what I get here isn't necessarily what you will get. Some of them could be a little bit lighter, more flexible, but in general, the Roaring Dragon is the highest status two-handed sword or longsword in the Warring States of China, whereas the Striking Eagle is more utilitarian and more of a fighting sword. And if you compare their hilt components, both of them have cord-wrapped, very long grip, so you can better use your leverage, but their geometries are completely different. On the Roaring Dragon, it's of an oval cross-section throughout the entire grip. There's some tapering in the thickness and width of the grip. And by the end, where it meets the disc pommel, it transitions into a cylindrical cross-section. However, where it meets the crossguard, where your main hand holds onto it, it's a very nice, comfortable oval cross-section. So we can index the edge alignment really easily, but there's no discomfort whatsoever. And the circumference is just right for my hand. Whereas the Striking Eagle has a different cross-section. It's basically a diamond cross-section with the corner rounded off. It offers excellent edge alignment for you to feel where the blade is going, but it's just not as comfortable as the grip on the Roaring Dragon. You can see here it's relatively thin, and I would imagine that people of various sizes of hands can hold on to this grip without any problem. If you look at the silhouette, there's not a lot of tapering in the grip. both in the width and the thickness, and it's a diamond cross section throughout. Now there's another core wrapping style available, which has a central white cord in the middle. Now lots of people complain that this comes loose during use. So I would say that this more traditional cord wrap is probably more reliable, and you can see there are 6 risers on the grip. So there are enough indicators for you to feel where your 2 hands should be, whether you want to choke up your offhand or glide all the way down to the pommel to use the maximal amount of leverage. It's really easy. But these cores have enough tractions. It's not really slippery, so you have a good command of the grip. Now obviously, in terms of style, I would say that the Roaring Dragon has more ornate hilt components, has fireworks all over the bronze furniture. The color of the bronze ages well, as opposed to the very yellow and burnished looking brass. Also, this brass furniture is very plain. Although on the crossguard there's a central beak, and this is probably the striking eagle, birds of prey motif. Otherwise, the pommel is just a plain brass cap. You can see on the scabbard there's a burnished brass bell loop with some cord wrapping, but also there's an end shape at the end of the scabbard. They're all plain looking to mirror each other. The scabbard is a plain wood core without any leather wrapping or core wrapping, except for this portion just below the loop. It fits rather well, but it just lacks some bit of sophistication comparing to the Roaring Dragon. I have to say I like the lacquered painting on the Roaring Dragon much more. In terms of fit and finish, it's per LK Chen's usual standards. This is excellent. The blade is made of folded steel from 1060 and TA2 steel. It's heat treated to be rather springy, but there's enough rigidity in the blade, even though it's quite long. So it's rather stable, has good performance, but also durable enough. If you look at the transition between the grip and the brass furniture, it's rather flush, minimal gap, yet the crossguard has this central ridge with a beak. Below it, there's a small gap, so there's a little bit of a ledge. Potentially it can be a hot spot, but you can avoid it if you hold the sword with your thumb on the side of the central ridge. It's rather comfortable. Or if you choke the main hand a little bit down, it's also very comfortable. All the edges on the crossguard are chamfered and rounded, so there's no discomfort at all. Between the grip and the brass end cap, there's a bit of ledge on this brass fitting. Could also be a hot spot for your pinky finger, but you can basically avoid it by holding it entirely onto the grip. There's enough space, especially when you have 6 risers on this grip to space out your hands nicely. Still, there's enough leverage for you to use. If you prefer to choke up your offhand, so both of your hands can stay a little bit closer, that's also possible. There are prescribed usage of using these swords as a spear, pretty much like late medieval and Renaissance two-handed European swords. However, there's no ricasso or unsharpened area at the base of the blade for you to do hop swording, but 18-inch long grip. There's enough space for you to hold it however you want. And if you use it as a short spear, primarily for thrusting and snap cuts, there's no problem at all. So overall, I would say that this is a fascinating two-handed sword with significance in history. As one of the first Zweihanders made by mankind, it's durable, performs really well with well-apexed edges. You can see there, even though the secondary ridges serves as a ledge, kind of like the shoulder created by secondary bevels, it's still not a hindrance to performance, but overall enhance the durability of the blade to make them resistant to bending and breaking. But also, the angle of the edges are large enough to resist chipping and deformation. So I highly recommend this sword to practitioners. Although the Roaring Dragon remains my favorite Chinese-style jian, I highly recommend checking out both swords at LK Chen and pick up both if you can. If you enjoyed this review, find any value or entertainment, please like and subscribe.